All right. Hello, everybody. Just going to give a few more seconds here to let some audience members trickle in. Thank you all so much for joining us. Welcome to Eco-Activism Portrayals in TV and Film, hosted by the Writers Guild Foundation in partnership with Storyline Partners. My name is Dustin Fleischman. I'm the Director of Events and Communications here at the Writers Guild Foundation. Just a brief intro about the WGF before we get started. So we're the nonprofit arm of the WGA West, and it's our mission to preserve and promote the craft of writing for TV and film. We host public events, panels, workshops with writers and industry experts. We have a bunch of community programs that help kickstart writers' careers. And we have a bunch of phenomenal resources for the greater writing community to tap into. You do not have to be a guild member in order to take advantage of our resources. And probably one of our biggest ones, for those of you who live in LA or are visiting in the near future, is our public script library at the Writers Guild headquarters. It's free and open to the public by appointment only, and houses tens of thousands of scripts from produced movies and TV shows. It's a great place to do some research on some of your favorite works out there, or get some writing done that isn't your traditional coffee shop. So again, you don't have to be a member of the WGA to take advantage of our offerings. You can learn more about the library and everything the foundation has to offer at our website, wgfoundation.org. I will throw that link in the chat along with a link to subscribe to our newsletter, since that's the place where we announce events just like this one. I definitely hope this isn't your first time using Zoom, but I just quickly want to remind everyone joining us, please direct your questions for our speakers to the Q&A box. That'll be in that lower Zoom toolbar. If you ask your question in the chat, and by the way, feel free to engage in the chat, say hello to everybody. I will go ahead and make sure that panelists and attendees can chat with everyone. So that feature is now enabled. We encourage you to engage respectfully in the chat, especially if anything discussed resonates with you. We also have closed captioning available. You can hit the show captions button again in that lower Zoom toolbar. And that is about enough out of me, because I'm really excited to get this panel and conversation started. So I'm going to kick things over to Sanaz to talk about Storyline Partners and introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Dustin, and thank you to everyone joining us today. My name is Sanaz Alesafar, and I lead Storyline Partners. We're a nonprofit collective of cultural consultants that advise on film and TV projects. And I'll help guide this discussion today on eco-activism portrayals in film and TV. This panel is the last in a series of discussions centering on pressing cultural narratives related to the upcoming November 5th elections. As a reminder, the First Amendment protects freedom of speech, the press, assembly, and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. It is the bedrock of a functioning democracy. Yet this right is slowly being revoked, and there's gross implications for climate activism and other social justice movements. Since January 2017, 21 states have passed nearly 50 laws that limit the right to protest. As grassroots organizations continue to grow and fight against resource extraction and fossil fuel industries, Congress, I may add, bipartisan, and mainstream media continue to portray activists as national security threats, as violent, as enemies of the state. They are borrowing from the war on terror rhetoric, and this is grossly problematic for those of us, many of us, in fact, that believe we need to move away from status quo and figure out new alternatives. So with that said, we are here to co-create new imaginaries and for this crisis. And we have a pretty rad lineup of writers, creatives, and experts. I'll begin with Dallas Goldtooth, an Indigenous environmental activist, actor, and writer from the critically acclaimed television series Reservation Dogs. This series centers 4 Indigenous teens growing up on a reservation in eastern Oklahoma and the Muskogee Nation. We also have Daniel Goldhaber, co-writer and director of the eco-thriller How to Blow Up a Pipeline, based on the book by the same name, written by Swedish environmental justice advocate Andres Malm. And the film shows a crew of young environmental activists that sabotage an oil pipeline in West Texas. And our third writer is John Raymond, prolific book author and co-writer of Night Moves, in which this film portrays 2 Oregon environmentalists and a former Marine that hatch a plan to blow up a hydroelectric dam. And last but not least, we have our ACLU rep, Senior Communication Strategist Allegra Harpootlian, to discuss the criminalization of dissent and protests and its intersections with climate. Thank you all for joining us. Before we start into entertainment narratives, depictions, stereotypes, and all of the sort of meaty things of storytelling, Dallas, this is specifically for you. Um, I would love for us to briefly engage in the status quo messaging of individual responsibility versus collective action and systems levels change. So, from your positionality, from the Indigenous sort of worldview and activism, how are you pushing back against that?
Great question. First of all, hi, Hamadakapi. Hello, everybody. Dallas Goldtooth. I'm Dakota and Dene, organizer from the homelands of my peoples in so-called Minnesota. And thanks. I say hi on behalf of all the other Indigenous peoples whose lands you're on. Hi, good to see you.
Hello.
Um, um, but no, it's a great question. I think that look, in the context of this conversation that we're going to be having today, I think it's just clear and it's best to be clear and straightforward that capitalism is causing climate change, or as I like to call it, climate chaos. It is a repercussion, it is a result of capitalism. And that, as many of us who have been fighting for a lot of systems change, whether it's issues around health, whether it's climate, whether it's reproductive rights, we have to understand how all of these struggles are all connected, and as a result, and they're all a result of capitalism and other forms of oppression that are perpetrated with the advancement of white supremacy. And so with that in mind, we just got to make sure we connect those dots and understand that our response cannot be an individualistic response. It has to be a collective response, as you framed in your question. And that in many ways, I like to say, and a lot of us have been saying this for a while, that the 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 talking point that, hey, you need to take individual action, just what really matters is if you're like recycling and you're putting in better light bulbs and you're getting a hybrid car, you're doing enough, ignores the fact that the system is designed in such a way that all that action is actually ineffective in the great scheme of things, and that doesn't really stop fossil fuels at the source. It doesn't really call into question the very system at the source of production. So that is my little two cents here.
I love it. We're hitting it hard. Okay. So with that, I do want to expand and continue with you, Dallas. Your character sort of conjured the character of Spirit in Reservation Dog uh, conjured this image, which was misappropriated back in the early 70s, the crying Indian, right? And I'm curious, um, you guys did such a great job in the writers room, right, in terms of dispelling and playing with these really messed up storytelling scenarios. And so how did you guys find the right balance between inserting these socially conscious messaging, right, of climate justice and its intersections, but also trying to be entertaining simultaneously? So not as didactic, right? Like natives
Yeah.
exist. Yes, we know you exist and thankfully you exist, but how did you merge that? What was the process within the writer's room, if that makes sense?
Yeah, first and foremost, as writers, you want to tell a great story. That's really what it comes down to, is you really
Hmm.
want to make sure your story is well constructed, well made, and that's the top priority for us. And I think it goes hand in hand that we as Native people, just as writers, as all Native writers room for Reservation Dogs, all Native directors, and a big thing about it is just telling our story and our experiences, and really trying to capture the lived experience as Native peoples as we are today, and not necessarily in a historical context, right? My character, the William Knife Man, is that historical context, but it's a twisted perspective of it because it's coming from the viewpoint of our own people, and and our expectation of how we know the outside world is going sees Native people, and we're just kind of upending that. So I think that, to be Native and to be Indigenous in society today, especially progressive Natives, um, we live political lives. Our lives are very political by nature. I mean, we're in the eyes of, in relationship to the federal government, Native peoples aren't ethnic minorities. Technically, we're political entities. We have a political relationship with the federal government as tribal nations. And so the very nature of us is political. So we experience Native peoples in the United States experience higher rates of a lot of the isms, right? A lot of the hardship, a lot of the struggles that we often hear about. And so by us just telling our stories about our communities, that stuff naturally comes forward. And so we didn't really like say, okay, we're going to send this message. We're like, let's talk about our lived experience and then connect the dots from there. So that was a big part of the effort there.
Well, job well done. I'd like to shift now to, the stereotypes of activists and how they're portrayed. And I'm continually thinking about who gets grace and understanding when it comes to their activism. It's very different, right, based on where if you're Indigenous, youth, right, religious minorities, etc. And so, John and Daniel, this is more set up towards you guys. Night Moves set in the 70s, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, the present moment. What influence inspired you both to go into this genre or this type of storytelling, which I find existential? And did you have any assumptions about activists or any sort of preconceived biases that came into that, or what was your process essentially? Whoever wants to start.
Sure, I can start. I mean, for me, it was a confluence of a few things. I very much grew up in the climate movement. My parents have worked in climate science basically my whole life. So, from when I was a very young kid, I kind of had like this specter of doom of global warming and climate change hanging over me. I would be in like middle school getting into fistfights with kids. I mean, like they would hit me because I would kind of be like, oh, the world's going to end because of fossil fuel usage. You know what I mean? Like that was something, it was a very present fear I grew up with. And that transitioned into when I was in high school. My first job in film was as an assistant editor on a movie called Chasing Ice. That was a great documentary that kind of followed a team of photographers capturing some of the first visual evidence of climate change, kind of in these time-lapse videos of melting glaciers, like this kind of, that took this abstract reality of kind of slow geologic change and translated it into something that I think felt immediate material for humans. And, I have a lot of respect for that film and for the people on that team, for the work that they were doing. But ultimately, I was also very present for a lot of these conversations that were happening around messaging and political messaging as it relates to, you have a film that's essentially making an extremely compelling case that the world as we know it is ending due to human action. And then you design an impact campaign around the film. And the impact campaign around that film essentially boiled down to, don't forget to vote, change your light bulbs, and maybe consider buying an electric car. And I think that I believe that people have a quite a good sense of kind of hypocrisy, political hypocrisy. And I think that to me, the result that I saw from that film and so many other kind of climate change, environmental awareness documentaries of the time were people saying, hey, the world is ending and here's the proof. And people being like, my God, that's terrible. What do I do? And the answer on the other side is nothing. Right? Because we know that these are not effective mechanisms of change because they've never been effective mechanisms of change throughout history. And so I think that I witnessed what I felt was like this bizarre side effect of the kind of like environmental awareness documentary movement, which I think it actually entrenched in action, because I think it ended up convincing people that there was nothing that they could do because the messaging was so divorced from meaningful action that now when we're living through this apocalyptic scenario, I think people feel like there's more nothing that they can do than ever before. So this has been a feeling that I've had. And again, when I'm talking about people, I'm generalizing greatly here. There's lots of activists doing amazing work. I don't want to kind of shortchange the stuff that's happening, but I do think when it comes to mainstream culture and mainstream political culture, I do think that this is the trend. So for me, I had always wanted to make a film and tell a story that I felt addressed this disparity that I had always seen inside of the movement. And when I read Andreas Malm's book in the winter of 2021, I felt that the book presented not just a fantastic moral argument, but I think that the thing that the book presents that I found both very cinematically inspiring as well as politically inspiring is, okay, so let's say that we need to escalate what we're doing. What do we do? Right? You can say escalation is needed, but who do you attack? Because you can't reduce the problem of climate change down to a single individual or company or even government. We all participate in this to some a far greater and some a far lesser extent. And I think that what Andreas boils this down to is he says, you know, the infrastructure is the enemy, that you can't reduce this to a single entity, but you can say that a pipeline through which oil flows that will be burned does not have a moral right to exist. You can at least make that argument. And if you make that argument, then suddenly you present an enemy and a target to activists who are looking to escalate. And I found that, again, both very politically inspiring, but it also suggests an antagonist for a film where the infrastructure is the fundamental target of a dramatic narrative. And through that followed the idea of making a heist film in which we really empathized with 8 characters, each of whom really has what they believe to be a justification for the destruction of this piece of infrastructure. And I think that we felt through that we may be able to provoke an audience to really consider the possibilities and the consequences of escalation, but at the very least, to, in all the ways that I had never seen escalation made concrete, to at the very least present escalation in a concrete way through a popular narrative context.
Thank you for that, John.
Great. Yeah, very excited to be here. Huge admirer of everyone's work here. Yeah, it's going to take me a second to get up and running here because this Night Moves came out a while ago, so I kind of need to remember even what it's about. But as with what Daniel was just saying, I mean, I do remember that the sort of initial question for me that led me into wanting to write that script was, why am I not blowing up the industrial infrastructure? You know, and it seems like an eminently reasonable path, and it's you know, bolstered by any number of, you know, rationales, as Daniel's film, you know, illuminates. And yet for myself, you know, I can tell, like, maybe whether out of cowardice or out of something, there's some reason that I don't do that, you know. And it is it became for me like a sort of a way to sort of meditate that on that in different ways. As with anything, there are many tap roots to where a thing comes from, and that film in particular came out of actually some friends of ours from my wife and I who live in Southern Oregon. The film is, yeah, it actually is at the time modern day. It feels like a 70s movie, but it doesn't take place in the 70s.
Forgive me. I totally thought it was the 70s.
Actually, there is a 70s movie called Night Moves, so it's a different, so it can easily be confused. But we have these friends down in Southern Oregon who are organic farmers. They're like seed farmers. They have a really quite radical practice down there, and they you know, grow only using trapped water. They don't take anything out of the watershed. They you know, have created CSAs, have created a real amazing community in this interesting valley there called the Applegate Valley. And we would go and visit these guys like every few months, and it became clear to me that this valley was just like a really super interesting place. Like, there are a lot of like dropouts and radicals and you know, old hippies and whatever, like a whole contingent of that that have been sort of creating a pretty off the grid community for generations at this point. But then there's also a kind of interspersed neighboring community that is really radically right wing, and it's like basically like Ron Paul libertarians, and it's like they all sort of live next to each other and drive around and like live basically the same life with many sort of mirroring kinds of ideologies, but they're sort of, yeah, grounded in different books, different worldviews, you know, and I just found it to be like a fascinating place. This was also sort of at the beginning of the Tea Party. This was like a moment when we were starting to see that stuff, and I was becoming interested in doing something about, for lack of a better word, like political extremism, like something where people were driven by ideology, like people who act on their ideology. And I cannot fucking understand the Tea Party people at all. Like I don't understand what they're doing, but I can understand how you could take the steps to do a radical direct action, you know, in an environmental milieu. And so that became a kind of imaginary way in for me in a certain sense. And then it's really, so these are sort of the political questions, I guess, that were kind of like leading into it. And then it's very much like Dallas was saying, like, your job becomes telling it as a story and sort of like creating a story that someone wants to watch and like to understand the sort of the ways that not that it becomes entertainment necessarily, but just that there's a certain structure that can organize your thinking. And for me, that became also kind of a heist structure, kind of a thriller structure, definitely like a noir structure. And so in that film, they perform an act where they blow up a hydroelectric dam. And then really most of the film, though, is the aftermath of that. And there's an accidental death that occurs, and then eventually a murder that occurs. And so it has a kind of definitely like a noir element to it, or a noir sort of energy. And I'll wrap this up quickly here, but like I've thought about it like in the, you know, you make a thing and then you get to sort of think about it in retrospect over the years. And it has been an interesting to think about. And there are ways in which I don't know if I would do it exactly in the same way. After it came out, I had a really interesting interview with an anarchist who had watched it. An anarchist who was very upset that like we had depicted a homicidal anarchist, you know, because there is this guy who ultimately does like perpetrate a crime. This person could not comprehend that an anarchist would be able to murder someone, you know, and put it in an interesting context about like, you know, it would be like, you know, the lesbian killer in the 90s, or like just any number of sort of sexual or racial sort of stereotypes, to which I was like, yeah, but an anarchist is not really the same thing as a racial or sexual or religious minority. Like it's an elective sort of position you're taking, you know? But as we were talking, like there were points that this anarchist was making that I found sort of hard to get around. And like one of the sort of answers that I ended up giving him at some point was that like there's something about the genre that I was working in, this kind of thriller genre, that sort of demands death, you know, something that there needs to be a killing. And the anarchist, like, I think quite wisely was like, well, maybe that's not a story that you should be telling then. Maybe there's something wrong with that genre, you know? And it's been a really, like, that thought has been in my head a lot. And I mean, I'm someone who's interested in genre. And I think there is like a really interesting sort of thing to think about as far as the relationship between genre and ideology. There's a great Marxist theorist named Stuart Hall, who I think defined ideology for me in one of the most interesting ways, that as a structure of feeling. It's like we think of an ideology as being sort of empirical or logical, but it's really an emotional sort of attachment. The same definition could be applied to genre. I mean, in a sense, ideology and genre are both structures of feeling that can kind of incorporate many different kinds of things, but you end up with kind of the same emotional point regardless. And so to me, that's like a thing that I bring forward into like how I want to think about writing something.
And I think it is, I kind of do want to chime in because it's very, you know, I've never met you, John, but it's very interesting hearing you talk about your thought process and also the way that the way that this confrontation happened shortly after the movie came out, because in a lot of ways, Pipeline was a movie that that I think was responding to Night Moves to an extent, which is, you know, a movie that I really like on a cinematic level, and as a film, but I think politically it was always something that also left me wanting for more in a similar capacity. Not because I necessarily think that there's anything inherently wrong with portraying an anarchist as somebody who's capable of killing in the way that you do, because, you know, I've been around enough spaces with enough extremist people and enough, you know, people who exist in, you know, extremist activist spaces because they necessarily want to be in places that operate outside of the law. These people are real and they are dangerous, but I think that the problem from my perspective is that this is almost always the only story that we tell about activists. We almost only tell the story about activism that fails, activism that is consumed by kind of ego, false leadership, etc. And so I think while I think that in like a kind of political vacuum, I do think Night Moves like works well as a movie. I think that part of what our motivation was to portray almost a kind of Hollywoodized version of an action that heroized, you know, some morally complicated figures in the same way that so many other, I think, instruments of capitalism are able to be heroized, the way that we might heroize, you know, people in the American military or, you know, the American cowboys in the West. You know, these are often people who we again, we afford moral complexity to, but at the end of the day, their moral complexity results in kind of a larger utilitarian moral victory. And I think that that was a nature of the way that we wanted to engage with genre, to kind of expand the possibility. And also I think that something that I said a lot when the movie came out is that I think that very often on the left and in these spaces, we only really ever imagine failure. We only really tell stories that imagine kind of a complex moral failure. And you see that with Night Moves, you see that with The East, you see that with all sorts of movies about activism and organizing. And I think for us, it just felt really important to push back against that and to imagine a narrative of success. So I think I say all of that only because I do think that the film that you made does do a lot of really great work. But I think for the context of this conversation and this, like, I think it is interesting to like legitimately place the works in conversation with each other, because I think our work came out of a place where it was in part in conversation with what you were doing.
Yeah, I don't want to hog it up all at all, but I'll just say, yeah, I hear that it's true. It's, you know, I mean, I'm more interested in vanity and failure and, you know, sort of radically flawed characters than heroic characters in general. But I think that all is true. And I guess for me, like the sort of ideological pivot I was trying to, or sort of core that I was trying to get at was really the sort of juxtaposition of the direct action people with the farmers that they're living with. And like, in a sense, it was those farmers who are the heroes of that film for me, and, you know, who get to give a little speech that kind of talks about like creating things as opposed to destroying things. But that's like, it doesn't get around the fact of like indulging in some, you know, stereotypical presentations of activists for sure. Yeah.
Dallas, you.
I don't want to. I know I don't want to take up too much time because I know
No,
we haven't heard
please.
from our other guest, Allegra, yet here. But what I think I really appreciate about the conversation, and also some of the points that you brought up, Daniel, around the film that you all made, is one thing I really appreciate about it is it did feel grounded in the climate action community of sorts, like the narrative, the way it's told. I think for those that don't know, in the climate movement, there's been a big push towards narrative strategy, and having really a full understanding about narrative strategy as a key tool to bring about the change that you want and develop successful campaigns. And I think it's really great, really key for us to understand, those of us who are also in the film industry. Of course, right? Storytelling makes the world go around. We all know it. Our world is constructed by stories. We make this shit up. We made it up. Fucking, what's currency? We fucking made it up. We just fucking make up everything. And as such, though, I think there's what we often fail to recognize, just as a society, is that stories don't just describe reality, they actively shape it. And that the dominant narratives, the way we tell stories, and the type of stories that we tell, can uphold the existing power structures that we actually are trying to critique. And so what I'm hearing from Daniel and both you, John, talking about is like, how do we tell the stories, and who are the protagonists, and what's the hero look like? And I think that in the climate movement, there's this big rapid development of like understanding movement building, and getting beyond I think a lot of our social movements are kind of getting into that space where it's beyond the person on the pedestal, and really like, how do we collectively hold each other accountable as we move forward? I think is a really big change and shift that we've seen over the past few decades, but especially in the past 15 years. The last thing I would just say is that I think that I'm just like, I'm trying to figure out how to say it, so I'll probably come back to it, because I know a lot of the work that Allegra has done on ACLU is overlapped around how the opposition has responded to us, right? And how the stories that we tell have been co-opted, and the words that we use have been co-opted, the language we have been used co-opted. Like, they wouldn't be using our language if it wasn't successful, right? That's the thing that goes about. And by they, I'm naming, the fossil fuel industry specifically, but it's also a wide range of industries across the board. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And that is a great segue to Allegra, which is break down the current moment for us in terms of the state and the vilification of activists, and what is protest at this point? I mean, there's multiple questions for you, but let's just start there.
Yeah, I think, throughout history, I mean, I think we've already, maybe in the prep call, we were mentioning the Tea Party back all the way in the Boston Tea Party. Like, I think there has been throughout throughout American history, throughout history in general, like protest has been a part of it, has been at the essence of it. I think also since the beginning of our country and everything else, there has been people who have really hated the protesters and villainized them. And it's the victors who get to claim, that. And I think, right now we're in a moment where free speech and free assembly and all of those First Amendment protected things are under attack, both at the state level, where, I think the last time I looked, there was 50 laws being proposed in different state legislatures relating to not only creating new crimes. So I don't know how much people on this call know about the fact that we have way too many laws. There are a lot that you can prosecute people. Like, we don't agree with all of them, but you can really prosecute people to the fullest extent of the law without creating new laws. And there is this aspect, though, of creating new laws, even whether it's blocking roadways is now considered domestic terrorism, or whether it's providing money to bail funds as signs of organized crime, an organized crime ring. Like, there's all these insidious attacks on free speech and free assembly, and it's a way of also scaring the crap out of people, right? Like, it is, I think there's a thing that we always say at the ACLU, that the most cowardly person should feel brave enough to go to a protest. Like, that is their right. And every time we talk about, every time they create new laws that criminalize protest, that villainize protest, that describe every protester as radical or extreme or violent, every time someone breaks a window and then the entire protest is called a riot or violent, it has really big implications both on who shows up the next time. So that chilling effect of who gets to speak and who gets to protest, I think it's always really interesting when you see when the law enforcement comes out. The ACLU works across a lot of different issues. We don't directly work on climate, but we do work on, obviously free speech, but then we have, repro and trans justice and immigration. And it is always interesting on which protests attract the law enforcement and which protests also are the ones that are abused the most by law enforcement. And so I think, when law enforcement goes in being like, all protest is dangerous, anybody in this protest could be a terrorist, could be a criminal, could be violent, could be extreme, all of these things, then they react that way. And then, media, I think the first step is news media, and I'm in comms. And so a lot of my job is relating to working with journalists and trying to make them, portray the story more accurately and more fairly, and think about who the narrators are and the heroes and villains and the real life aspect of things. But I think then it goes into pop culture, right? And so I think when you see these sensationalized, protests, like I think, this is about, environmental terrorism, not the words, environmental activism. But I was like, oh God. But you see it in Law and Order or in whatever, like random show, and it's depicted, it's only that one protester. And so I think there's a lot of interesting aspects of all of our panelists here where we need to show different protests, like different people who are coming to the protest for different reasons. I thought, How to Blow Up a Pipeline is such an interesting way of showing the different motivations and different histories and experiences that get people to unite around, a singular cause and collective action, and how they each got there for different ways. And I think, part of since I've been at ACLU, I've seen all different types of protesters. There are people who engage in civil disobedience. There are people who engage in, destruction of property, but also there are people who I've seen that are like college kids who are literally getting in trouble for doing a study in a library. And I think there's something uniquely wild about, a library study-in being depicted as something that needs to be shut down and punished. Whether it's the fact that colleges are bringing in security or, even just suspending and excessive punishments, all of these things kind of just clamp down on free speech and also clamp down on our right to protest unfair and unjust government policies. And I think these like free speech zones are so dangerous because if we keep restricting, there's only, so far that we can go. And, at that point, also people start acting outside of things. And I think there's a aspect of like, how do you keep the pressure up and how do you make your voices heard when the system is stacked against you?
So
And I think, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please. Go ahead, Daniel.
I was just going to say that I do think that I think it's really important to keep our eye on the ball of the very real ways that speech is being criminalized. I also think that part and parcel with that is I think that we also have to, something that I'm very interested in is, and this is obviously something that Pipeline explores, is to also, I think, be aware of the fact that I think a lot of the tactics that we've been educated about as the tactics that kind of do lead ultimately to systemic change, I don't think that those tactics themselves are working the same way that they used to work. And I think that there is a narrative capacity there that's really important to acknowledge in terms of our responsibility as storytellers to think about the fact that there was a time in this country where when you turned out a lot of people to the streets in kind of extreme protest, the government kind of perked up its ears and said, all right, we have to institute some sort of change. But that hasn't existed for a long time in this country. And I think that one of the most specific things that I point to is the fact that in 2020, we had the single largest mobilization of people protesting in American history. And ultimately, I think that while the Black Lives Matter protest had a lot of demands and a lot of things that it was asking for, I think that the messaging of those protests really did ultimately coalesce under defund the police. And I think that it's really important to recognize the fact that since those protests, most police budgets have gone up. Many police budgets, I believe in over 50 cities, have gone up more than 10% in the last 3 years. And I think that it's really important that we have to kind of acknowledge the fact that while protecting protesting and protecting free speech is important, there's also a higher question that needs to be confronted, which is that in a world in which even when we do turn people out into the streets to exercise our right for free speech, that isn't leading to the kind of change that's being demanded. I think that we have to then kind of recognize, all right, what tactics now need to be employed in order to ensure that change does happen. And I think that we've seen this repeated in many ways since the Iraq War protests in 2000. Or 2002. But it's something that I'm really interested in, and I haven't, necessarily coalesced around how to message that, but just kind of a thought I wanted to put out there.
What I would add to that is also just to understand the dynamic of not just the nature of organized and nature of protest has changed. It's just the very nature of how we consume that. As cliche as it sounds, we have to acknowledge the dynamic of how media and the consumption of media also has altered the way organizers and groups say, all right, how do we get our message out there, right? And how do we get into the sound bites? How do we break the mainstream? And finding that you have to escalate your tactics more and more. And so that's also puts further pressure on these communities. And so it's very much real. It's very much real. Having worked, before I was a writer, before I was working on Reservation Dogs, I worked for the Indigenous Environmental Network as an organizer and did nonviolent direct action, NBDA as they call it, peaceful civil disobedience trainings. And that's a common conversation that would come up is like, okay, how do we evolve our tactics and messaging? How do we evolve how does the movement evolve to meet the crisis right now, but also stay principled in our actions? And I say that by also knowing, and I mean, when it comes to discussions around violence and usage of violence, I'm from a personal standpoint, also the people I work with in communities I'm in, is like, hey, we have a common vision of strategy, but understand there's a wide variety of tactics, and there's other folks that we're not going to condemn other people's tactics if we're aligned in the same vision and principle in many ways. And so I think that's also a dynamic that we have to acknowledge. How, look, there's shorter attention span, there's more outlets for folks. It's like the challenge for a lot of people is like, what do we have to do to get attention? Because like Daniel said, getting 500,000 people out to the streets, I mean, that's page 2 in the New York Times, if that.
I just really appreciate, Dallas, what you're saying about the cost of this, though, that then we escalate, then that escalation serves as a pretext for a further crackdown, both against free speech, but also in other areas of civilian life. And this is a really vicious cycle. And I think that one of the only hedges against that cycle is to create a culture in which the powers that be can't as easily get away with that. And I think that, it's in a media environment that is so hyper consolidated and hyper corporatized, it's very, very hard to do that. But I think that, I appreciate seeing other artists out there who have their eye on that ball.
And I just last point on it. It's also, as we evolve, we have to understand, there's a phrase we use in like a lot of the work that you do around narrative strategy is, where do you find the points of intervention? Like, you're trying to change the story, right? What we're trying to do is reframe the narrative. Black Lives Matter reframes the narrative around police violence in the United States, specifically within the context of Black communities. Land Back reframes the conversation around Indigenous sovereignty and really helps us understand the relationship between land theft and Indigenous rights and Indigenous peoples, as well as like settler colonialism and how it operates here in the United States. Me Too movement, another reframe, a narrative reframe. But in all of these, in all of our efforts, we're also trying to find, where do we like intervene in the narrative? Where do we where do we see the opportunity to fucking just jump in there and say, okay, shake people up? And that's why you see smart strategies of like, okay, we've done the mass mobilizations, we've done the protests. That's cool, whatever. Like that's what you want to do, you can do that. But let's start going to the CEOs, their houses outside their homes. Let's start going to the media. Let's go after the insurance industry, who's bankrolling all these fossil fuel projects who never get any criticism. Let's go after the banks. Let's start calling out the other people here who are very much complicit in the destruction of Mother Earth. So those are also other ways that we have to get more creative. And you're seeing that where people are trying to find ways to intervene.
Allegra, like, what is the legal bounds of protesting at this point? So if we were to go in front of the CEO's house, if we, were to take, more charged actions other than petition and letter writing and sort of the usual civic engagement routes, like what is permissible? Can we boycott?
I was like, oh, charge question.
Yeah.
Because I was like, essentially, I will say I'm not a lawyer, so none of this is construed as legal advice. But I think, one of the biggest things that every state and every locality actually has different laws. And so I think one is being very familiar with the laws of the community that you are protesting in, that you like know what you're getting yourself into, know if you're going to get a felony, if you're blocking a sidewalk. I mean, that would be absurd. Maybe it would be absurd. But I think, on the rights of boycott, like the ACLU believes that the right to boycott, I mean, America was founded on a boycott. And it is a purely protected First Amendment speech. I would say, unfortunately, just like I don't think the courts will always save us, there have been really bad decisions on the boycott, on anti-boycott laws, including in, I believe, the last one was an appeals court on a case in Arkansas that we had asked the Supreme Court to take that case last year. And after the circuit court had decided that was not protected, and the Supreme Court declined to take that case. And so while the ACLU does believe that the right to boycott is a First Amendment protected activity, and we will continue to fight for that right, it is a little bit difficult to win that case, unfortunately, and the courts keep getting worse. And so I think to the point of like changing tactics and thinking about creative ways to make that change, I think that's something that legal institutions like the ACLU are still thinking of as well. I think, on civil disobedience, the ACLU, we have the line, we do not take on cases of civil disobedience, but we do understand and really appreciate the really amazing work and the change that comes out of civil disobedience. And I think the big thing the line that we toe is that you can't excessively punish somebody for civil disobedience, or use excessive force, or you charge them for more things. You can't, that can't be excessive, and it can't be unlike you would treat any other protester or any other kind of infraction, especially kind of a misdemeanor, a small crime, things like that. And so I think it gets into a gray area, but I think there are a lot of amazing legal firms that do work in this area, including the National Lawyers Guild, SPLC. And I think the big thing, though, is that to the point of, as you criminalize more things become illegal and more things become punishable. And I think it is such a slippery slope. And we're in the local laws, the state laws, the federal laws, all of those things create that air of repression and make it even harder for people to speak out. But, I would say that the free speech, the First Amendment protects a lot of us. I mean, I'm like, the First Amendment protects a lot and we want to strengthen it at all. And so I'm like, the ACLU is really here to fight back on that. But unfortunately, the courts will not always save us. And I think that's something that the ACLU has had to grapple with as well.
I think it's also worth, one of my favorite movies on this subject is Ava DuVernay's Selma. I think is a really fantastic movie about the nature of organizing. And I think one of the core tenets of that film is, and this relates both to what you're saying, Allegra, but also to the complicated position that I think the ACLU is that most successful tactics throughout history have been illegal at the time that they were implemented. And even if they weren't illegal, they were illegal enough that the police could still give themselves a pretext to beat protesters senseless. And I think that along those lines, I think that, again, another place where I think our responsibility lies as storytellers, which does not make us political or legal advocates, but as people who construct a culture that we live in through narrative. I think it's important for us to recognize the fact that most of these tactics throughout history have not been legal at the time. That, you know, if you think this was something that, you know, we were talking about before we started this conversation, but if you think of essentially the founding act of disobedience of this country was the Boston Tea Party, which was a mass act of property destruction. That was not a legal act. That was an illegal act of resistance against what was seen as an unfair government intervention. And I think that it's really important that we recognize the fact that the point of protesting and the point of a lot of disruptive action is precisely that, to disrupt and to challenge the system's ability to say this is how things are done or this is not how they're done. And I think it falls on us as storytellers to provide the moral architecture through which some of those acts of illegal disobedience can be interpreted. Just because something's illegal doesn't make it bad, I think, is the point that I'm trying to.
Yes, no, understood. And I will say I see where you're going, and I co-sign with your statements. We have a couple of questions. As much as I want to delve more into everyone's praxis, we have Audrey here who asks, how do you differentiate writers between activism and propaganda in film?
I mean, this was something that we thought about. Oh, go ahead, Dallas, if you have an idea.
I mean, it's a great question, because in a way, it's up to you as a viewer. I think it's almost like I would say it's the difficult thing, right? And you have to, of course, there's a number of topics in our writing that reservation dogs are very difficult for Native communities, and we had to be very mindful of the responsibility that we carried of how we talked about it. And I'm talking specifically about suicide, right? And what we are trying, and being mindful of what we are saying and what we don't want to say, because of the repercussions or how it might impact our own communities. And I think that is, for all artists, that's there, right? Is being mindful, like there's an audience that's going to take this in. But to a certain extent, that's the beauty of art, is that you leave it, there's interpretation for it. This is like not answering the question, but I wanted to take an opportunity to say it, is I think really one thing that's very important for us to understand and us to start uplifting is that there is a difference between an activist and an organizer, and that we often confuse those so much, and that we present activists as a dirty word, when really what we're seeing people do is organize their community for a collective good. And that we whittle it down to like, oh, it's an individual doing some extreme acts, rather than, hey, there's a group of folks who are working collectively for an betterment of their community, or to have self-determination about what happens to their land, air, water, or bodies. And I think that's really important for us to start reframing that of like, yes, we have activists. An activist is somebody that shows up. They show up, you can depend on them. They're there. You're saying, hey, something's going down at 5 p.m. I'm there. I got you. And organize the one that's making the phone calls. The organizers are the ones that building the conditions for people to be empowered for change. So I think that's something I really want to emphasize in this effort, is that really for us to remember. And so back to the question, I don't know. It's kind of a hard question. I don't really like the question, but the way I see it is, activism, it's a way of motivating people for something constructive. And that's where I would say is like, all right, is this really in line with my vision of how we're going to build something better?
I'll just chime in, and the question made me think about, I mean, just speaking for myself, like, to me, there are political questions that that frame every kind of story, certainly that I'm interested in, and I think arguably any story. I mean, it's like, it's a political question that kind of leads you into it if you're wanting to go into something interesting and relevant to other people. To me, like, it's kind of then once you're sort of once you've established your political question, then to me it becomes a process of like, I guess, character, and like understanding who the characters are and what they're doing. I feel like I once read an interview a long time ago with Cornel West, who was talking about the sort of double sort of guides that he follows. And he was talking about Marx on one hand and Chekhov on the other hand. And it's like you have Marx, establishing the sort of structural situation that you're interested in. And then you have Chekhov, like, who's presenting really fallible, flawed, interesting characters. And I mean, to me, that's there's a politics to that too. I mean, that's to me how one avoids just doing agitprop, which has its place, but like is for me, like not that satisfying.
Daniel, I know you want to chime in. Sorry, I was like, the only kind of one little note that I also wanted to like kind of raise here is the like propaganda question, like the word propaganda, like who gets to say what is propaganda? I think a lot of times in Hollywood and in depictions of movies, we're seeing CIA propaganda, we're seeing military propaganda, we're seeing US government propaganda, but it's not depicted as propaganda because it's the military or the government or the intelligence agencies, and they're like the source of truth. And I think that like one of the most, I think, like fascinating and promising aspects of Hollywood in the last couple of years is this kind of movement to start realizing there are other narrators that should be centered and that have incredible view. And so I think that like my fellow panelists are all doing such amazing work at that, because I think there is this thing of the activist versus propaganda. Like, is it activism or is it propaganda? But also, like, are the stories that we're telling about activists and about these also a lot of activists are like incredibly experts in their own field and have so much knowledge and are coming at this in such a knowledgeable way. And I think the like aspect of whether it's propaganda for a cause or whether it's actually just finally telling the full story for once or the other side of the story, I think is just a really important point to note here as well. Sorry, Daniel, to pass it over to you.
No, I've talked a lot. You're all good. I mean, I think for me, the fundamental difference is just between storytelling. A good story has a counterpoint and is a more complete argument, and presents a moral complexity. And I think the benefit of that is that I think that those stories and those narratives can last much more deeply in the culture. Even if you think about the kinds of stories that we build our culture around, they're often stories in which characters behave complexly, like biblical stories, Shakespearean stories, what have you. And I think that is something that I think is able to take a much deeper root. Whereas I think often, propaganda reduces itself to good guys and bad guys. And those aesthetics and those stories can have, I think, a very temporary power, but it's often fleeting.
Wonderful. And on that note, we have one more minute. Any parting words? Well, thank you so much, everyone. To my writers, Allegra, you guys are incredible. Can't wait to see you. Oh, is there anything to plug? I feel like there's some plugs. John, what's this book? What's this new book you have?
I'll just plug if you support the organization I used to work for in the Indigenous Environmental Network, great folks doing great work. Indigenous organizations honor the earth. Amazing folks do good work. A small organization, a smaller one is called Pueblo Action Alliance, doing great work around in New Mexico against the build-up of the hydrogen fuel hubs in the Southwest. So definitely check them out and the all amazing work that they're doing.
Thank you for that.
Let's leave it at that. That's great. Yeah.
All right. Well, I believe John has a book out called Denial. And Daniel, what are you working on? Anything we need to be aware of at the moment?
Nothing that has a release date yet. So
Okay, cool. Well, we'll be in support. Thank you so much for this enlightening conversation, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.